Good morning, everyone. I dare say this is the first time that the Nautical Archaeology Society has had a contribution from Shropshire, which is very inland and has, as far as I can think, two claims to nautical fame. The first is that in the middle of the 17th century, it was the birthplace and the training ground of Admiral John Benbow. But the principal claim to nautical fame for Shropshire is that it stands more or less at the top of the navigation of one of the major rivers of the British Isles, the River Severn. And we're talking about a river that rises in Wales, is about 230 miles long, and the navigation extends over about 130 miles from Gloucester at the head of a tidal estuary to just over the border into Wales, just short of the town of Welshpool. This was the usual limit of navigation in the Middle Ages and remains so today. This morning, I want to look at a stretch of the middle upper Severn, downstream from Shrewsbury to the Ironbridge Gorge. This is about 50 miles above tidal waters, about 30 miles above the locked and dredged middle section, which starts just around Stourport. And it is, thank goodness, in a state of nature. So no locks, no powercraft, or very rarely outside towns, no dredging, again, a bit in towns. The channel, just to have a look at the watercourse, this is the section I'm going to be looking at, the middle upper Severn. So it features places like the village of Atcham a few miles down next to the National Trust, Attingham Park, and then a mile or so further down from that, English heritage is Wroxeter Roman city, Viraconium. That's the section I'm going to look at. And through this section of the river, the channel, and this is a not completely atypical section, is about sort of 40 or 50 meters wide, a meter to 2 meters deep, generally speaking, but with much deeper spots and also much shallower spots where the river runs over gravel shoals or fords, as they're known, which in a dry summer can give you less than 20 centimeters of water under your keel, or something like, something pretty shallow anyway. And then occasionally you get minor rapids leading to Ironbridge Gorge, where you've got the scarier rapids, great, but they're still only grade 2 at Jackfield in the middle of the Ironbridge Gorge. As I say, powered craft are virtually unknown outside urban areas, thanks to the twin hazards of weed and shallows. So the only craft you ever really encounter are paddled ones, canoes, kayaks, and paddleboards. In the historic past, it was navigated by trows, barges, and boats, and that's in size order, as well as by log boats and coracles. Commercial boat owners would traditionally maintain what they called a set of larger and smaller vessels, such that navigation could continue in all but the very driest conditions. Log boats, by the way, were in use in Shropshire's late 17th century, and the word trow, that sort of traditional craft on the Severn, basically the word trow is related to the word for trough. So that kind of gives you a clue as to what's going on there. In wintertime, at least, barges and trows capable of navigating the estuary down to Bristol would have been encountered right up to the head of navigation, though more often a town like Bewdley or Gloucester, Bewdley's on the middle Severn, would have been used as a transshipment point into a larger or smaller vessel. And the other thing about the Severn, which is great, is that it is that scandalously rare thing in England. It's a free navigation. And has always been so. So it was known as the King's High Stream of Severn in the Middle Ages, as I delight in telling anglers when they give me a hard time. Access to the waterway from the banks can be difficult. Not here, because it's vegetation free, because you're on the outside of an eroding bend. But the banks are generally covered with quite thick vegetation where it's not been penetrated by anglers down to the water's edge. The banks themselves in this part of the river generally stand about 2 meters or so above river levels at summertime, and they're composed of 7 floodplain silt, which has been building up steadily since the advent of agriculture in the early Bronze Age. Where you can define Roman period activity, it's generally buried about 1.4 meters down under the floodplain surface. So I want to share with you briefly now uh, 4 types of archaeological phenomena: bank exposures, quarries, fish traps, and bridges that are all almost uniquely accessible in this part of the river by small paddled craft, and then conclude with some thoughts more generally on access by paddlers to the archaeological resource. Right, bank exposures. Being close to the water level in a canoe or a kayak offers a close-up sectional view of the bank and thus the composition of the floodplain. In particular, the presence of paleochannels, where they're cut by the modern watercourse, become visible from, low down, more or less at water level. So in this slide, what you see is the pale grey anaerobic silt down at the bottom of a big paleochannel full of organic, prehistorical, preserved organic material in the primary silt. And at this particular point, a few years ago, the channel deposit included a complete oak tree, which still had its bark on. It was about 1.5 meters in diameter, 2 or 3 meters long. And at that time, as soon as I sort of found it, I drew it to the attention of the National Trust archaeologist because the National Trust owns the land around there. And I also drew it to the attention of archaeological scientists from the University of Birmingham, who were in the middle of a project called the Wroxeter Hinterland Project, looking at the way that landscape and settlement had changed around the Roman city. The National Trust took a slice out of a tree to try and get a dendro date. That didn't work out, but C14 dates from the organic material in the channel deposit, in which this was then firmly stratified, came out in the Middle Bronze Age. The botany, the pollen and plant macrofossils, plus the beetles showed that the tree had fallen into the channel sediment a generation or so after primary woodland clearance in this part of the Severn Valley. Now, paleochannels are everywhere. Not quite this everywhere. I mean, this is a bit of a cheat. This is one of my favorite maps. This was made by the US Corps of Engineers in about 1943 and shows part of the Mississippi with the present channel and the great sort of loops of previous channels cut through by the present channel. The Severn, I don't think was, as I say, quite that crazy, but when you look at the LiDAR coverage, and we're looking at a section of the river immediately opposite the Roman city of Wroxeter, well, first of all, the eye picks up at various points the various kind of serpentine curves, the wiggles that represent just stray sections of paleochannel where they are still evident on the surface. And they're also evident if you're silly enough to go out on a flood and you go across the floodplain when there's only a couple of feet of water over it. As you paddle along, you get a kind of instant series of soundings coming back on the line of kind of slurp, slurp, slurp as you go over the muddy field, then through to splosh, splosh, splosh as you basically cross a paleochannel. But the LiDAR actually puts that kind of thing on the map. And one of the most interesting things from my point of view as a medievalist is looking at the way that the ridge and furrow of high medieval, early medieval and high medieval cultivation in the floodplain has been kind of fitted around, contorted around old channels, and particularly the scroll bars along the banks and the wet spots of old prehistoric channels underlying it. What I want to do now, we've had a quick look at one paleochannel, which is kind of in a state of nature, as it were, but you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen a red line, which indicates the site of a second paleochannel, right bang opposite Wroxeter Island, opposite the Romans, across the river from the Roman city. And I want to have a look at that in a little bit more detail because things have happened there. Right. So what you have here is a fairly standard paleochannel exposure, as seen in low summer conditions. So from the bottom up, what you've got is post-glacial gravel deposits, and then a root mat of organic material preserved underneath anaerobic, very fine pale grey silt, which is almost like pipe clay. It's very kind of sticky. It's actually very pleasant material. And then on top of what looks like about 50 or 60 centimeters of paleochannel primary silt, you've got your standard floodplain silt accumulated over that to a depth of a couple of meters. The story of investigation of this paleochannel began for me in, I think, 2012, when I found a piece. I was canoeing past, minding my own business, and then noticed a piece of pink Severn Valley Ware Roman pottery, very distinctive, sitting right at the water's edge on the bank. So I went and gathered it up, and then noticed that there was one just underwater. And so I gathered that one up, and then became aware that there was a trail going off downriver. Anyway, I followed that for about 30 meters into sort of a 2 meter depth of water, and recovered all the pottery by the simple means of jumping overboard while hanging onto the painter of my boat, and took the bits back home, and they all joined together, which was interesting, because there's no real reason why one should find most of a Roman vessel in the floodplain. Nobody lived in the floodplain, nobody got buried in the floodplain. What's a whole pot, or half a pot, or a third of a pot doing in the floodplain? And I think the answer became slowly apparent from the form of the rim, which is ever so slightly wavy. And it struck me this looked like a kiln waster, and that might explain what it was doing there in the Severn floodplain opposite Wroxeter. So the question then was, if there was a kiln in the floodplain, where were they getting the material with which to pot pots? And then the idea occurred to me that maybe the Romans were actually using the primary silt out of the paleochannel as potting clay. And I didn't know quite how to kind of address that question, but I was dealing at the time with the National Trust archaeologists based in Attingham Park, and one of them, Viviana Caroli, confessed that she was, in her spare time, a potter. So I brought her a sack of the primary silt out of the paleochannel, and she potted it up and came up with some really quite convincing replicas experimentally of the second century Severn Valley Ware jar, which I'd found. The results are pretty convincing, and there's not much doubt left in my mind that this and maybe other paleochannels in the Wroxeter floodplain were exploited for clay in the Roman period, producing pottery, and on other sites, brick and tile and kiln fabric. Now, we never saw the actual pottery kiln, but having kind of been sort of made aware of this particular exposure, I've kept an eye on it ever since. And as the river erodes back with each flooding episode, it goes back about 6 inches, 10 centimeters or so every year, depending on what kind of a winter. One sees a variety of small industrial features exposed in section. You go back next year and it's, you know, a section a bit further back, and so on and so on. And what you can see here in section are two small domestic scale ovens, which I think would have been a clay-lined hole in the ground with a kind of chimney-like structure and a stoke hole. And you see there's burnt material in them. Not only that, but above these features, the floodplain silt has got a distinct pinkish trend to it, which to me suggests kind of a process by which, with seasonal flooding, a field full of industrial activity of little tiny ovens, which would have probably been producing like small metal objects, basically they got washed down every year. So the burnt clay has kind of infiltrated the floodplain silt and has left this pink layer. And then, as well as the features that you see here, there's a certain quantity of pottery which erodes out, and bits of kiln furniture every year. So, I think that one is on reasonable grounds for saying that there was small-scale industrial production in this part of the floodplain, particularly as it's an area which is close to a dry Roman road. And basically, if this hadn't been kind of observed as a byproduct of recreational kayaking, all this stuff would be kind of without record somewhere off Western-super-Mare, I would guess by this point. Quarrying paleochannel silt was a big surprise. Whether it happened in other periods, in other places, whether the early medieval potters used similar sources for potting clay around Shrewsbury, I just don't know, and I don't think anybody does. But quarrying for building stone is certainly not a surprise. Because, of course, sandstone outcrops all the way down the Severn, and it's furnished building materials for major projects throughout the Middle Ages. So, for instance, Worcester Cathedral is built largely from the products of riverside quarries at Highley, near Bridgnorth. One medieval quarry on my bit of the Severn, the Middle Upper Severn, that's come to light is at a place called Ighton, and it remains very difficult to access any other way than by the river. And it was designed that way. So here what we have is an outcrop of red Bridgnorth sandstone, which has been cut back for a distance of about 10 meters from the edge of a river, leaving a series of flat shelves on which barges could be moored and then loaded from the quarry face above and then floated off as and when levels rose. The quarry face, which is going to, of course, be on the left side of that slide, looks like this. It's all red sandstone, quite a friable, not a very good weathering sandstone, but you can see instantly that it's a quarry face from all the straight corners and also from the millions of pick marks that basically decorate the whole face. The color distinction here between the red and the gray basically represents plastered sediment, because the annual height range of a Severn it varies from it varies about 5 meters from low summer levels to the worst winter flooding. So what you see here is flood silt plastered up against the quarry face. Now, we know a little bit about the quarry because it belonged to Shrewsbury Abbey. It was a Shrewsbury Abbey manor, and they used the stone for their own precinct about 8 miles upstream from the quarry. And here you see a reconstruction of Shrewsbury Abbey, which was an interesting process of commissioning about 20 years ago. And the stone from the quarry is specific to a single phase of building from the 1390s into the early years of the 15th century. The abbey itself was a riverside foundation, though the southern channel you see at the bottom of the slide has long gone. Basically, the flow was slowed down by the construction of a bridge, and it gradually silted up and then was culverted and disappeared. The sandstone was used to build the west tower of the Abbey Church, which is a well-known local landmark. It was used to build, and this is the middle star at the bottom of the screen, a waterfront range, which has kind of evolved between the 13th and the 15th centuries. And it was also used to build a kitchen, a new kitchen built in about 1400 to service guest accommodation in the western part of the precinct. And that was excavated by Birmingham University in the 1980s. Gosh, blimey, 10 minutes. Right. Okay, fish-weirs, very rapidly. Fish-weirs are a recurrent feature of the River Severn, and particularly this part. And we see here the latest surviving weir, a photograph taken in about 1914. And what you have here is a series of fish traps arranged in echelon across the river, which are still represented by physical remains actually in the riverbed. So what you have are stone and stake dams, but in this particular instance, what you have also is reasonable preservation of timber, Given that this was the last surviving weir on this part of the Severn, this timber may be well preserved, but what you're looking at are the sole plates on the front of the at the base of the kind of gallows-like structures, which would have supported the putcheons or the actual fish traps. Going now to Atcham, a few miles downstream from there, again, the fish weir is evident in the form of a triple line of stakes. As far as I know, this is not a post-medieval site. This is a purely medieval site, but the context of these stakes is only really apparent from the offshore view, which you can only get by getting on the water, because what you see, if you look up at the riverbank above the stakes, is a great big dam. You can see the interleaved layers of gravel and sediment, redeposited sediment, forming a bank about 1.5 meters high above water level. Bridges. This is, again, we're staying in Atcham. Atcham has been a bridging point over the Severn since 1220, when the manorial lord, the abbot of Lilleshall, built a bridge there. What you see in this slide is a ferro-concrete bridge from 1926 in the foreground. John Gwyn's last surviving 18th century bridge from 1780 in the background. The site of a medieval bridge wasn't known until recently, when basically I sat in the beer garden of the Mytton Mermaid pub talking to Jeremy Milne, the then National Trust archaeologist, about getting access to the River Tern. And we became aware gradually that what we thought was the pub garden rockery was in fact a bridge abutment with genuine medieval corework sticking out of the bottom. So as a prospection technique, I propose to christen this beardar. So a bit of poking around in the kayak suggested that the rapid with which, I was familiar as a canoeist offshore at that point was not a rapid, not a natural one, but it was basically stones, building stones left in situ in the riverbed. And at that point, a map of 1746 became available to us, which we'd not seen before. And that showed the multiple arched medieval bridge exactly where we thought it must have been. The red line, the diagonal red line you see on that map, I've just put on there to indicate the finding of an associated structure, which is a wharf, which nobody knew about. And again, only apparent when you're right close to it, but it's a fairly massive thing, 30 meters long, stands 1.5 meters above the riverbed. What's it doing there? Well, I have read, I'm afraid I forget where, of the probability that some medieval multiple arch bridges as navigational hazards made good transshipment points. And I think that's what's happening here. And it explains something, which is that Atcham was actually created in the 13th century as a new town, which is nuts because it's just outside Shrewsbury. It's an hour's walk from Shrewsbury. But when you think that the journey by river into Shrewsbury from that point is like 7.5 miles plus 5 fish weirs and another bridge, you can see that there would be a temptation to get goods into town a lot faster by offloading them at that point. Now, as I'm running out of time, I'm going to very briefly talk about the River Tern, which runs through the National Trust, Attingham Park. Absolutely inaccessible on foot because of a jungle-like vegetation either side. They lost a medieval bridge there because the park was expanded, the road was moved, and the remains of the medieval bridge basically were found. I was invited to go up it with my boat, and what you see here is in fact a lot of medieval window tracery, which was reused material from the recently dissolved Ormond Abbey, which had been put in there in the mid-1540s by the local landowner who owned the ruins of Ormond Abbey and basically was recorded as having repaired the bridges of Tern and at Atcham. And I did a survey of the site in 2015 for the National Trust, basically with high-tech subaqueous gear in the form of waders lent to me by the National Trust's head warden. And here you see it on that 1746 map. So what we had in that case was the western abutment and the western pier, and the other bits of the bridge remain buried underground. And then later along came LIDAR, and the National Trust had its socks blown off basically by the revelation that their rolling Georgian parkland was a preserved medieval agrarian landscape. Sorry, I'll go back to that. And winding between the strip fields, you can see the holloways indicated there approaching the medieval bridge site. And then very rapidly, another place where bridges can be found by kayaking is in culverted watercourses. And I regret I don't have more time to share my adventure going underground in Bristol. I went basically some distance underground, was very pleased with myself, and then found out that the culverted course of the Castle Moat is well known on the internet of all places, and that's what I've been going up. I got as far as a weir where the Castle Moat on the top right of the slide meets the River Frome, all of it culverted, but navigable, known to Bristolians. This vessel is used by council workmen, and it was known as the Dead Dog Boat. Anyway, what we found on this expedition were the remains of medieval bridges trapped in the culvert arches above. Basically, when they culverted the river, because it was full of sewage, they just left the bridges in place and culverted up either side. And here you see basically what that last bridge arch looked like when it was in the open air, looking very picturesque, but please note the overhanging privies either side of the watercourse, which explains why it was culverted. And then finally, basically, here's the sort of shell-shocked city archaeologist, Bob Jones, with that kind of, what did you just do to me, Nigel, look on his face. And all I want to say by way of conclusion is that I've been looking at kayaks, canoes, paddlecraft generally as a means of transport for getting your archaeologist into what I reckon is one of the remaining less explored historic environments in the UK, but paddled craft can be made very accessible. So here you see one of my annual tours around the Severn River Loop around Shrewsbury, and the craft that the visitors are using are pairs of Canadian canoes lashed together with spars and twin-hulled open canoes, steel, basically made of thin steel, but the canoeing guys, the professionals, call bell boats, was not an expression I've met with elsewhere. We go around the Severn Loop in Shrewsbury, seeing what there is to be seen. And if we've got a small party, we'll even take them up a minor watercourse, which you see right at the bottom of the slide, so that everyone can have a taste of being an urban explorer, but in perfect safety. And we did this trip, I know, with two 89-year-old ladies who were both retired World War II Wrens. So I recommend canoeing not just as a means of getting professional or amateur archaeologists into difficultly accessed historic environments, but getting everyone into fairly difficult to access historic environments, and to see a completely new vision of what the past of their local watercourse actually looks like. Thank you very much.